In these two articles, one of which lists out the worst investment strategies in American history, the other, the 8 best. In the first article, I pulled away one of the worst investments in American history, and it involves a name with which you may be familiar. Ted Turner founded the CNN channel, the 24-hour news network, the TBS Superstation. All of us in the Southeast were blessed to watch every single ball game the horrible Atlanta Braves played through the 1980s. Every loss, every bumble, in fact, the Braves were the worst team in Major League Baseball in the 1980s, and because of the WTBS Superstation, we got to watch every single game. Anybody remember that? Well, Ted Turner in 1999 took his company, Time Warner, and merged it with the CEO Steve Case's company, AOL. It was a $365 million business deal. That was in 1999. From 1999 until 2002, unfortunately, that company lost $99 million. Now, these numbers, I've got to be honest with you, I don't really comprehend them. I am not familiar with what is $99 million. I just know it's a lot. In fact, Ted Turner took a personal hit because the stock dropped so drastically, he himself lost $7 billion of net worth. I looked just yesterday to see what is his total net worth. He's still worth about $2 billion, so don't feel too sorry for him. That was a bad investment. Let me tell you about one of the best investments from the other parallel article from Think Advisor. There was a man named John Pemberton who was born in 1831 in Knoxville, Georgia. Some of you may not know there is a Knoxville, Georgia. It is in Crawford County. It is about 20 to 25 minutes northwest of here. It is the county seat of Crawford County. John Pemberton was born there. He ultimately began practicing as a what's that? A pharmacist. He ultimately began practicing as a pharmacist in Columbus, Georgia. While he was there, this was after he had served in the Civil War and received a saber injury from which he developed a dependency on morphine. And in order to try to get off the morphine with a non-morphine solution, he began to toy with different ingredients and different recipes. And he ultimately came up with a recipe that would really not be medication, but would be something much bigger. Pemberton moved to Atlanta, where in 1891 he sold that recipe, of which he had given a kind of a catchy name, Coca-Cola. He sold the recipe for $2,300. Now, before you frown at that, no, that was almost $60,000 in today's money. He sold it to a man named Ava Candler. You drive around Atlanta, you see some streets named Candler and some areas with the name Candler attached to them. Asa Candler bought the recipe to Coca-Cola for $2,300. That was a pretty good little haul for Pemberton. Unfortunately, about 30 years later, Candler sold the recipe to Coca-Cola for $25 million. $322 million in today's money. Now, I guess that particular investment, you could either look at it as the worst or the best. Where Candler was concerned, it was the best. He had an 833% return on his original investment. How many of you, if you thought you could get an 833% return on your investment, would invest that money? I mean, I would. Kind of sounds like the lottery, really. But anyway, that's kind of how it worked out. I guess for all of us, if we invest money, if we invest time, if we invest talents, if we invest resources, we want to think that which we have invested will have a great return. We want to think that we're going to invest these things wisely in such a way that they are effective and that they glorify God and that they ultimately turn out to be a good investment. I have some good news for you today. One of the best investment advisors to ever live has a word for you today. His name is Jesus Christ. Christ has called His followers to invest wisely with what we have. If you have your Bibles with you today, I want you to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 16. Luke chapter 16, as we continue this series called 6 Questions for Jesus on Giving. Now, we have been in the book of Acts for a long time. We paused the last Sunday of 2018 in the book of Acts. We're going to finish up this series, and we'll pick up the book of Acts again and wrap that up here in the spring. However, today we are continuing this series, and we have one more Sunday in this series on 6 questions for Jesus on giving. Jesus had a lot to say. We're looking at a parable today, which is a story Jesus told with a spiritual point behind it. I want to share with you a little bit of information that you may or may not have known. Somewhere between 35 and 40% of all Jesus' parables were about money. Somewhere between 35 and 40% of Jesus' parables were about and are about money. How to make it, how to save it, how to give it, how to spend it, how to invest it. Time and time again, He shares parables and stories about that very thing. Well, as we pick up in Luke chapter 16, know this. In Luke 15, the chapter before the passage that we're studying, Jesus had been speaking to the lost Pharisees in chapter 15. In fact, He tells the parable of the lost coin. He tells the parable of what we call the prodigal son. He tells the parable of the lost sheep, the 99 and the 1. And all of these parables were to reinforce to the Pharisees how God dealt with lost people, how God will expend every ounce of energy and effort to reach the lost. Because the Pharisees had been criticizing Jesus for being around lost people. Imagine that. The Pharisees were criticizing Jesus for being around lost people. Let me say this. While it may not be wise for your very best friends to be lost people, I mean the people that you spend the most time with, that you pour your life into, that you share with, that you confide in, because they may not have the spiritual wherewithal to give you direction on where you need to go. That said, it is also unwise for Christians to never have interaction with the lost in order to be able to share Christ. And so Jesus, the time He spent, the most intimate of times with His 12 disciples, with people like Lazarus and Martha and Mary and good friends who were followers of His, the time He spent with them was His intimate time, was His close time, was kind of his best friend time. However, there were plenty of times He spent reaching out to the lost, and that's what we see in Luke 15. But we come to Luke 16, and if you'll look at the first phrase of verse 1, you notice He turns to His disciples. Verse 1, He says, He also said to His disciples. So at this point, Jesus turns from speaking to the Pharisees about how God reaches the lost, and He turns to His disciples and begins to talk to them about how to walk with the Lord. And when the gospel account says His disciples, that may or may not be just the 12. Oftentimes when we talk about Jesus' disciples, we think of just about the 12. But no, in this case, it does not specify the 12, so we can assume that there were more than just His 12 here. Any of those who were followers of Jesus were considered His disciples, not always just the 12. In fact, in the gospel accounts, there are times where when the gospel writer is referring to just the 12, it refers to them as the 12. There is one point in the book of John, I believe, where Judas has already betrayed Jesus and gone away, and technically there's only 11, and yet the Bible refers to them as the 12. So they were kind of a unit. In this case, the 12 are not referred to, so we can assume that there is a group of people gathered here who are followers of Christ. Refers to them as His disciples. Now, what we're going to look at this morning is verses 1 through 13. And there is a clear distinction in this passage. It is a difficult parable, but there is a clear distinction. Verses 1 through 8 are the actual story that Jesus tells. So verses 1 through 8, I'm about to read those all together. They tell the story that Jesus told. But beginning in verse 9 all the way through verse 13, we find the application that Jesus makes relative to his story. And so let's begin kind of with this idea. We're going to be looking at investment strategies that Jesus gives, the first of which is verses 1 through 8, right? And it is the proper pattern of investment. The proper pattern, that is the direction, the pattern, the way, the general direction you need to go in an investment. Verse 1. There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." Then the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." So called every one of his master's debtors to him. And he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." Let's take a look and kind of walk through this parable and see what's happening. We can assume that the parable is a story that Jesus makes up. Now, how do we know if any of Jesus' parables actually happened or they're just stories he made up? I want to suggest to you that a story like the rich man and Lazarus, the fact that he uses a personal name suggests to me that it was an actual story. Many of his other parables, he uses generalities. He refers to people in general. And I have to assume they're stories he made up, stories that could be true, but may or may not actually be an event that Jesus is speaking about. So here in verse 1, it says you have a rich man. The word rich there literally means opulent. And so in levels of rich, he was up at the upper echelon of rich. So not only was he wealthy, he was the wealthy of the wealthy. So there was a certain rich man who had a steward, that is a manager. Some of your translations actually use that word, manager. And an accusation was brought to him. It would seem like the problem moved up the channels. Somewhere, somehow, somebody got to the wealthy landowner, the wealthy man, and went to talk to him about what his manager was doing. Let me tell you about this manager. This isn't just any manager. This manager is someone who would oversee all of the business of this rich man. In fact, it would seem that the rich man is probably somewhat of an absentee owner. That is, he traveled a lot or was away or was maybe away on business. And so he left this guy in charge of all of his staff, in charge of all of his accounts, in charge of everything that he had, his crops, his business dealings. This guy was a little bit like Joseph in the Old Testament was to Pharaoh. I mean, he kind of handled all the business except for being the owner. Verse 2, so he, that is the rich man, by the way, in verse 1, it says that the attention was brought to the rich man, that this man was wasting. That is a present active. I want to point that out because it means when the rich man caught his manager, he was still involved in this behavior. It wasn't a past tense thing. He was continuing to be wasteful and even dishonest about it. Verse 2. So he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." You're fired, is what he just said in verse 2. Ironically, though, it's interesting to me, And it suggests to me why this rich man was having trouble with some of his employees. He tells the man, you're fired. You've been misappropriating funds. I'm going to give you basically a 2-week notice, if you will. So how do we know that? Because what happens next takes some time. Just a kind of a side parenthetical statement. If you are a manager or you are a business owner and you find out someone is stealing from you and you fire them, do not give them 2 more weeks. I'm going to give you 2 more weeks to steal even more from me, and now you don't even have the concern that you're going to be fired because I already fired you. So maybe this suggests to me why this rich man was having trouble with his business in the first place. Anyway, so he gives the guy basically a 2-week notice. Verse 3, then the steward said within, the manager's talking to himself, what shall I do? My master is taking the stewardship away. He's firing me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. In other words, I'm ashamed to dig, and I'm too scrawny to do it. I've been working behind a desk too long. And why he brings up digging, I guess digging jobs were pretty plentiful back then. I don't know. Maybe you could find a digging job on any street corner, I suppose. But he wasn't about to dig because he couldn't do it, and he was ashamed of it, and he was ashamed to beg as well. So verse 4, I have resolved what to do. When I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. This is very important. Verse 4 is what I might call a hinge verse. Notice what the manager says. I am going to prepare that as I'm being fired, I have prepared myself for my future life. Otherwise, I have no future. Otherwise, I don't know what I will do. So I'm going to do something now so that when I am fired in the future, I have prepared kind of an arrangement for myself. Everybody get that? He's preparing for his future. That's very important. Verse 5. So he, the manager, called every one of his master's debtors to him. Now someone may ask me, Pastor Johnny, how do you know he got like a 2-week notice? How do you know he had some time? Well, this guy was pretty wealthy that he worked for, the manager worked for, right? And it says here that he called every one of his debtors. Now you tell me, without a telephone, without a telegraph, without internet, without any kind of an electronic device whatsoever, or a communication device, he would have had to literally either dispatch some of the workers to bring in the debtors, or he would have had to go see them himself. I'm suggesting to you probably he went to see them himself, and it says he went to all of them. That was a lot of people. Now here in just a moment, we are only going to get an example of 2 people. Let me suggest to you that that is a representation, because it says in these verses that he went to all of the debtors that the rich man had. That takes some time, is my point. Even if he visited 2 or 3 a day, it would still take time. So we can safely assume that this guy was given a little bit of time to get things in order. The rich man, all he wanted was an accounting of the manager's stuff. And what the manager was going to do was make sure he took care of himself before he was gone. And so verse 5, so he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. Each measure was probably 8 to 10 gallons. And this was probably olive oil. And so there was anywhere from maybe 900 to 1,000 gallons of olive oil that he owed the manager. Usually during the harvest time, they would trade, kind and kind of materials or resources or crops. So at harvest time, this guy was going to owe the master this oil, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill. That is, the manager says to the debtor, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Huh, I like that. You owe $100? I'll tell you what, just write 50. And you owe $1,000? I'll tell you what, write 500. Watch this. He's not done. Verse 7, then he said to another, how much do you owe? So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he, that is the manager, said to the debtor, take your bill and write 80. Lops off 20%. The first one he lopped off 50%. This one he lops off 20%. Now I'm going to pause here for just a second. This is one of those passages that I have read probably no less than about 10 different commentators. Usually when I'm preparing a message, I don't consult commentary, so I'm almost done. I've got to confess something. I kind of fudged on my own rule on this one because I was trying to get an idea of what the general consensus was. I'm going to be honest with you. There's not a lot of consensus on this parable. Some suggest that the manager is actually just taking off the interest that the debtors owe. The interest. Now, I don't know how many guys charge 50% interest, but I guess some do. That would have been on the first bill. But I'm going to suggest to you that while that is a good explanation, right? That the manager was just simply taking off the interest off the top and then just making them pay the principal back. That is a good explanation, but it is not necessarily in the text. The text does not necessarily explain that to us. So for me to say he was just taking off the interest, I have to do a good bit of reading into the text, and I don't like to do that, right? Because we want to say what the Scriptures say. We don't want to say what they don't say. Another commentator suggested that maybe the manager, was just taking off his own commission. Now, I don't know how many bosses give 50% commission on what their managers earn. That's quite a bit. That's a lot. But there were commentators who suggested maybe this manager was just taking his commission off the top and then just making the debtors pay back the other. Again, same thing. That is a good explanation, right? It's not really clear in the text that that's what's being done. In fact, when I read the text, do you know what I read? This guy is setting things up in such a way to help himself and cheat his boss. Well, his former boss, I suppose, sort of. He's serving out his 2-week notice. It looks like to me the guy's just simply cheating his boss. Now, verse 8 comes, and we really struggle with verse 8. Right? Verse 8 is just, it kind of like when you take vitamins in the morning. Has this ever happened to you? You don't drink enough water and they get caught right here in your throat. Does that ever happen to anybody else but me? Am I weird on that? Okay, all right, so it happens to me. It just gets caught right here. You can drink a gallon of water and it still just stays caught there, it seems like. Anyway, that's what verse 8 does to us kind of spiritually, I think, or emotionally. Look at what the master says. This is Jesus' story. Jesus made it up. He can make it turn out however he wants to, right? Verse 8, so the master commended the unjust or the dishonest. How many of you have a translation and it calls him the dishonest servant? That's an accurate rendering. He's dishonest. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Why did he commend the steward? Not for his dishonesty. He commends the steward for being wise and being shrewd. Notice he doesn't hire him back. He doesn't say, you know what, you can come on back in the business. Oh no, that doesn't happen. The guy still gets fired. The manager still is out of a job. But the rich guy says, you know what? I see, I get it. You really took care of things and were wise in preparing for your future. You're saying to me, Pastor Johnny, are you telling me that Jesus is using a dishonest man to make a spiritual point in one of his stories? That is exactly what I'm saying to you. You ever heard the parable of the unjust judge? And the woman keeps going to him and saying, I need help. There's this guy who's hassling me. There's this guy who's giving me trouble. I need help. And Jesus said that unjust judge says, I don't care anything about this lady. But finally he helped her, not because he cared, but because he was fed up with hearing from her. And Jesus goes on to say, listen, if an unjust judge is going to answer this lady who was persistent, how much more will a gracious, loving God answer when you're persistent? He uses a guy who was had a little bit lack of character and integrity to make a spiritual point. He does the same thing here. And here's the point. Are you ready? It is the proper pattern of investment for believers. That is, when we invest our lives, when we invest our monies, when we invest our materials, when we invest our time, let's do it. What we have in the present, let's invest it in such a way that it's investing for the future. Verse 8, Jesus says this, for the sons of this world are more shrewd or wise in their generation than the sons of light. He says, lost people tend to know they want to prepare themselves for the future. Too often Christians don't do the same, and he's not talking about life insurance, and he's not talking about 401ks, and he's not talking about Social Security. He's talking about something far different. He's talking about taking what we have now and investing it in such a way that it prepares for future in eternity. I remember when I was just a brand new pastor, the Rehoboth Baptist Association had asked me to go out and plant a church out on the edge of Crawford County in Byron, Georgia. A church that now is still there. Our dear brother Jeff Greist is the pastor there, has been for the last 10 years. In fact, he and his wife Sherry just celebrated their 10th anniversary as pastor there this year. But I was 22 years old when we planted that church, and Alyssa and I had been married just for a year or so, not long. And went out there and planted the church and had the support of the Rehoboth Association, First Baptist Church of Warner Robins, and the Georgia Baptist Convention. All three had kind of combined together to pay my salary, which was nice. And so I sat down early on with a gentleman who was part of the Georgia Baptist Convention, a gentleman named Stanley Hendricks. I think he's passed on since then. But Stanley was very involved in like ministerial tax law and investing, and he was really a support to pastors. And so he sat down with me, and we began to talk through kind of that first time I'd really received a real salary as a pastor. I had served churches before that, part-time as youth pastor and that kind of thing. This was the first kind of full-time salary I'd received. And one of the things he suggested to me was this. An organization that then was the Southern Baptist Convention Annuity Board. That is, that provided health insurance and life insurance for Southern Baptist employees and pastors and denominational employees. It's now named Guidestone, by the way, and still we operate through that. He strongly urged me to purchase life insurance through what is now Guidestone. And we talked, and I got to be honest with you. I was being paid a full-time salary, mostly, as a church planter, mission pastor. I don't have to tell you, it was not a large salary. And here my bride and I were together, and we were new in marriage, and we didn't have a whole lot. And I'm thinking about taking a portion of my money every month and paying it toward life insurance. I'm 22 years old, and I can't possibly imagine needing life insurance. You know what I did? I listened to Stanley because he was a guy who had been around. He had been years in ministry, and I listened to him, and we purchased that insurance then. That the way Guidestone works, if you purchase it early on, you can keep it all the way through as long as you're a Southern Baptist employee. We still have that life insurance. It's still the same price it was when I was 22 years old, and I don't have to tell you it would be a lot more if I bought it right now. A lot more. See, here's the thing. By God's grace, God put someone in my life to help me see I need to prepare for the future. That's what Jesus is doing here. But you know what he's saying? This is a lot more than about life insurance. This is a lot more than about your Social Security or your 401ks or your retirement or your life, or any of that stuff. This is about preparing for well beyond future in this life, but life in the next. And he said, while lost people seem to understand they need to prepare for this future, I'm telling you, saved people need to understand they need to invest what they have now in such a way that it prepares for the future and eternity and beyond. And so now Jesus, in verses 9 through 13, begins to make application. So if verses 1 through 8 was kind of the proper pattern for investments, verses 9 through 13 are what I want to call some powerful principles of investment. Let's talk about three principles Jesus shares as a way of application, beginning in verse 9. Verse 9, Jesus' first application is this: begin investing the temporal for the eternal. Let me say it again. Begin right now investing the temporal in such a way that it is for the eternal. Verse 9, he says, and I say to you, that is, disciples. Remember verse 1, we said he's speaking to believers. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon. Now, by unrighteous mammon, he's not saying all money is evil. He's just saying money is not necessarily holy or unholy. It's just a kind of an object, a neutral object. It's not that it's evil in and of itself. It's just money is money. It's not some kind of a great spiritual thing. But you can take money that's not necessarily a spiritual entity, and you can use it in such a way that it has spiritual impact. He says that when you fail, that is, when you leave this world, when you leave this world, the way you have invested on this earth, they may receive you into where? An everlasting home. Well, where's our everlasting home, believers? It's heaven, right? There's only one thing this could be. Invest right now with your temporal, material, time, money, possessions, talents. Invest now in such a way that when it's all said and done in eternity, you'll have a place. You will have invested in there. Jesus says it another way. Invest right now where moths can't eat it away, where thieves can't break in and steal, where it doesn't rust. Invest in eternity now in ways that it can't be touched. Jesus says the same thing with that. That's what he's saying here in verse 9. Take your temporal and invest it in the eternal. I got a question, kind of a one-question pop quiz. Who was referred to as the son of encouragement? Barnabas in the book of Acts, right? And in the book of Acts, he was referred to as the son of encouragement because he was an encourager. But there's one particular act it speaks about of Barnabas. It is that in Acts chapter 4, it says that Barnabas had some property, right? And he sold that property. Anybody remember what he did with the proceeds? He gave it, yeah. He brought it to the apostles and said, take this and use it for ministry. Let me ask you a question. I wonder how many people are in heaven right now because of that property that Barnabas sold then. It's 2,000 years ago. Do you think there are people who were lost then who got saved and are now spending eternity in heaven because of that property Barnabas sold? I'll guarantee you that's the case. Do you think there are people who were concerned about their faith or who were concerned about being taken care of, that were ministered to, and an eternal impact was made in their lives because of the property that Barnabas sold? And let me ask you a question. Could Barnabas possibly have conceived of something like Green Acres Baptist Church 2,000 years later when he sold that land? No. He couldn't have conceived of churches 2,000 years later. All he knew was that he was going to take what he had and pour it into something that would last way beyond his life. So let me ask you a question. Before you leave here today, can I exhort you to determine whether or not you are investing your temporal for eternal? I want you to prayerfully consider, are you investing your temporal for eternal? How about your life? That's where it begins, by the way. You want to invest your temporal for eternal? It starts with giving your life to Christ. Lord, here is my life. My sin separates me from you. Lord, I know that only by the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross can my sins be forgiven, and can I have a relationship with you and begin to walk with you. And today I confess my sin, and I turn to you, and I receive your forgiveness. I repent, and I confess my sin. That's where it begins, folks. You can give $1 million to this church, and if you're lost and you've never been born again, you will never experience the beauty of eternity with Christ, no matter how much you give. Now, if you want to give it, go right ahead. God will still use it, but you will never experience the blessing of eternity because you're lost. So maybe it is your life. You need to start there. Maybe it is your income for giving. Are you on a regular basis using the money, the resources God's putting into your life to invest in things that right now you may or may not see the advantage of it, but you know that in the eternity it's going to have impact? Or maybe your time. Well, sometimes it seems like we're investing time and maybe it seems like it's not doing any real good, but I'm telling you something. What if you take your time and invest it right now in such a way that 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, there are people who had the impact of the gospel in their lives because of the time you invested now. So begin investing the temporal for the eternal. Look at verse 10. Jesus goes on to make one more application, or one of two more. It is this: begin investing now and not waiting for later. Begin investing now and not waiting for later. Verse 10. He who is faithful in what is least, faithful also in much. Let me say that again. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. That is, if you don't have a lot, but you're not faithfully seeking to serve God with it, why would you think God would give you more just to be unfaithful with that? Do you really think if you're unfaithful in a little, that when you get a lot, you'll all of a sudden, presto change, you'll become faithful? Look again at what Jesus says in verse 10. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. You want to start investing in eternity? What are you waiting on? What are you waiting on? You waiting to get more? Why would you think that having more would all of a sudden make you become generous? Why would you think that having more would all of a sudden make you consider eternity if you're not considering it right now? There's a story I came across this week. And there was a missionary that was at a church, and he was preaching about a mission that they were to take off on in weeks, and he was raising money. And an offering, a missions offering, was taken at the end of the service. One of the ushers was coming down the aisle. There was a man that he knew rarely came to church, but every once in a while he would come to church with his wife, but he was a hard man. That man was sitting there with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face as the offering was taken. So that usher, being pretty quick, paused at him and kind of held the plate over him. This is not something Jerry Cole, the chairman of our ushers, will do or teach our ushers to do, but it is part of the story. So he kind of waved the plate in front of the guy, and he just sat there. And the usher just kind of drew his head down and said, "Sir, this offering is for the mission work." The guy said, "I don't believe in it." The usher, being pretty smart, stuck his head back down, and he said, "Well then, sir, why don't you take some money out, seeing as the offering is for the heathen anyway? Why don't you get started right now? Good, bad, or indifferent. Begin investing now, not waiting for later." Look at verse 11. "Therefore," Jesus says, "if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon," that is, if you've not been faithful handling material possessions and time and things that are of this world, who will commit to your trust the true riches? What are true riches? Well, we know the scriptures that teach the true riches are things that last in eternity. They don't rust. The moths don't eat them. Robbers don't steal them. That's the true riches, the stuff that really lasts. I like to have stuff that's going to be around, right? You buy things, you try to get good quality products that you're not going to have to turn around and buy again in a year or two. Or less. You want to get something you buy and it lasts for a long time. Well, how about something you invest in and it lasts for eternity? Jesus says, verse 12, "And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own?" He just compares what we have to being somebody else's. You see, here's the thing. The reason you take the things you have and invest them in something else is because the things you have aren't yours anyway. Verse 13, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." The reason he compares God and mammon is because the mammon we get is God's. And if we serve the money, then we're serving the very thing that God owns. We've taken it on as ours. We've assumed possession of something we do not own. There was a story back from the 1980s from a TV show called B.L. Stryker. Burt Reynolds starred in that show. I don't think it lasted very long. Anybody remember that show? Oh, a few of you do. Burt Reynolds fans. Huh? The late Burt Reynolds, right? He passed away back in September. Anyway, they were in West Palm Beach, Florida, filming one of the episodes of B.L. Stryker, and they needed to do a scene in like a front yard where they had explosions going on and cars wrecking. And they went to this house, and a guy came to the door, and they talked with him about what was going on, that they would pay him, but they needed to do this scene out in the front yard. And the guy's like, "Sure, that's fine. Yeah, you can do it right out here." Well, they began filming the scene, and the director got a phone call from the local police. Apparently, the guy who gave them permission to blow up stuff in the front yard was renting the house. And the owner who lived in New York was calling going, "What's going on in my house?" That guy renting that house, he did not have the authority to tell them what they could or couldn't do, did he? It wasn't his. Oftentimes, if we're not careful, that's the way we treat our stuff. Our time, our money, our possessions, our material things. We treat them as if they are theirs. But Jesus says this, you ready? Begin investing with the knowledge that it is God's. Begin investing with the knowledge that what you have is God's. It's not yours anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, Christ has called His followers to invest wisely with what we have. In the book of Acts 16, the Apostle Paul and his team have arrived in a city called Philippi. The reason Philippi was so important is because it was the first city, are you ready? It was the first city in Europe where the gospel was preached. So Paul and his team showed up in Philippi. Some of you remember some of the scenes, the Philippian jail, the earthquake, the jailer and his family getting saved, all kinds of Paul and Silas getting thrown in prison, singing hymns in the middle of the night. But you may or may not remember the beginning. Paul and his team showed up, and they went out by a little brook, a little stream, like a little creek river. And there was a lady named Lydia in a group meeting out there for prayer. There was not a synagogue apparently in Philippi, so they went out there to meet in prayer, Paul and his team, and Lydia got saved, and her family got saved, and guess what happened next? Lydia offered to let the church meet in her house, and she was apparently a lady of some pretty well means, which was unusual in that day because it was hard for females to establish a career back in that time. And so she began to let the church meet in her house. And from there, the church in Philippi grew. By the way, if you read the letter to the Philippians, the Philippian church was one of the key supporters of the ministry of Paul. The Philippian church was one of the closest churches in terms of relationship with the Apostle Paul. You think Lydia, when she just took the simple step of opening her house to the church, had any idea what was about to happen? Do you know Christianity is still the largest religion in all of Europe? Do you think Lydia could have known that the gospel would spread across Europe, starting in Philippi, starting in her house? All she did was open up her house very simply. By the way, some risk to her as well. Because remember, Paul and Silas were thrown in prison. She took some risk, opened up her house, they began to meet. Do you think she could have known that the gospel that was spread across Europe would eventually be carried to America and would eventually spread across a nation, spawning a church like Green Acres Baptist Church? Do you think Lydia could have known that? Certainly not. I'll tell you what she knew. The house I have is really God's. And I'm just going to make it available to Him, and He's going to do what He wants to with it. And I'm asking you, are you taking the stuff you have right now, your time, your income, your material possessions, and saying, Lord, I don't know what you might do with these things, but for your glory, help me to know how to invest them in such a way that they're creating an eternal impact. It begins by coming to know Christ as your Savior, giving your life for Christ. Is that you? Do you need to be saved today? I'm just telling you. You can come forward. We'll let you go sit down with someone and talk. And they'll explain to you what it means to be saved here in just a moment. Or you can come right now as far as I'm concerned. Maybe it is you just want to come and pray. Lord, continue to give me wisdom. Continue to give me direction. I just got a raise at work. I just got a new position with the hiring. Lord, help me to know how to invest it. Lord, I just realized I have a little bit more time, and help me to know how to use that time for your glory. Or Lord, whatever I'm doing, help me to know. Maybe you just want to come pray about it. I'm going to pray here. And as the Lord leads you, you respond. Hey, maybe it is coming to be a part of Green Acres. That's kind of a part of giving. You are placing yourself here as a servant in what God's doing at 901 Alberta Road. And you come. Pray with me. Father, in Jesus' name, help us to obey you right now. You stand. As the Lord speaks to your heart, you come. As we stand, you come.